Okay, so last week we ended with America becoming independent and adopting a form of government to have the 13 colonies working together. They called it the Articles of Confederation. And as I tried to explain last time, from the viewpoint of the folks who adopted it and ratified it in the late 1770s, early 1780s, the Articles seemed like a sensible way to operate because we weren't really a nation then. We were 13 separate entities, separate governments, sort of trying to work together because they needed to defeat the British, but otherwise, not in the mood to merge. Oops. Don't run, really. We don't want any accidents. Okay. So as I said, the article seemed like a good idea at the time, but as we're going to find out today, rather quickly, a good number of Americans, particularly the social and economic elite in the country, almost immediately they started having second thoughts about the Articles, and within a short period of time, the Articles were toast. So what went wrong? Excuse me. One problem was the 1780s, during and after the Revolution, was not a good time for the American economy. That's what happened to our foreign trade as you come up to the Revolution and then when the Revolution starts. There were some, you can see a couple of dips early on that reflect the non-importation agreements I mentioned last week. But then, of course, once the Revolution starts, no American ships are heading anywhere because the British Navy is going to stop them. And no British goods are getting here because the British Navy doesn't want them to. So our foreign trade pretty much died off, and it only recovered slowly in the 1780s, partly because in a fit of vindictiveness, the British closed the ports in the West Indies to American ships, and we had sold a lot of rum and food, lumber, all kinds of things to the British West Indies, to Barbados and to Jamaica, but that was no longer. The other thing is, as I said, these are 13 separate governments, and they each wanted to try to raise money by regulating trade. The easiest way to make money back in that era was to tax things as they come off the boat. And each of the states wanted to do that with things that were coming off the boat, but only some of the states had good harbors where they got a lot of trade. New York City being the most obvious example, but Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston. So the states with good harbors started taxing imports. The states that didn't have good harbors, like Connecticut, offered a free trade zone. Come land here, and we'll take care of your goods for you. You don't have to pay anything. And then the idea was you'd ship the goods from Connecticut into New York. But the New Yorkers got annoyed, and so each of the states was putting up like tariff walls. Imagine trying to ship something from here to South Carolina, and it has to go through several different states paying taxes every single time. It was a real burden on the American economy. And beside that, the nation was in an enormous amount of debt. To finance the war, the first thing Congress did was pull out the printing presses. So they started printing continental dollars, continental currency, and I've found a copy of one of them there for you. Now, money, right? Money is an IOU. Money is a confidence instrument. I'll take your dollar bill from you in exchange for something I want to sell you, because I think I can use my dollar bill someplace else to buy something. Okay, but suppose you don't really trust the dollar bill and you're not sure somebody else will take it for full value. Well, then you might not take it for full value. And what basically happened is, with inflation and people being skeptical that the government would ever be able to repay the Continentals, they were trading at 1,000 to 1 by the early 1780s. So people were scooping them up if they had money, they were scooping them up for a speculative investment, but the people they were paid to, soldiers during the Revolution who had to buy stuff for their families, those people had to part with their Continentals at a lower rate because merchants were skeptical. All right, we also had debt, bonds that were issued, and we had borrowed a lot of money from France. Congress couldn't raise money. It could only ask the states to give it money, and the states weren't in a charitable mood. By 1787, we were in complete default on the loan to France. Much like a developing country today, we owed our developed country creditors a whole lot of money that we couldn't pay. And the states, too, had borrowed money during the war. And by the 1780s, 2/3 of the money the states raised in taxes were just going to pay interest on their state debt. They had a lot of interest. And then lots of individuals were in debt. And just to try to, this is a world without banks. Okay, so if you want to borrow money for your business, you don't have a bank to go to. Where do you go? Well, you go to some wealthy person in the town, a merchant, a lawyer, a large planter with a plantation. You borrow from rich people and then try to pay it back. And many individuals couldn't afford to do it. You also had states trying to collect tax money in coins, gold and silver, and people didn't have coins around, especially farmers out in the western part of the states. So you have a lot of debtors who want lower taxes and they want protection from their creditors, and over half the states helped out by printing their own money. There they are. There's some of the examples I could find. It looks like there's some shillings, there's a dollar. They're mostly in shillings. Now, with the revolution, the property requirement for voting in the state governments dropped a bit, and you had, because of popular pressure, so you had more farmers and shopkeepers and artisans in the state legislatures, and they were happy to vote relief for debtors, including issuing paper money, either because their friends were in debt or they were in debt themselves. With the paper money, of course, you get inflation, and that, if you're in debt, inflation is your friend, and that was the goal. But that wasn't, even the printing presses weren't quite enough to protect some of the folks in the rural areas who didn't have money to pay taxes, and so they started taking matters into their own hands. And up and down the western segment of the country, western Massachusetts, western New York, down into the Carolinas and Virginia, you had a lot of farmers receiving the tax collector in not such a nice mood. There's one. I don't know where that engraving came from. So in this quite a large region of the country, farmers were preventing the tax collectors from collecting, and they were preventing the courts from sitting, and they were preventing sheriffs from seizing property to pay off a debt. The tax collectors could take your farm, but not if a big crowd showed up and scared them away. It was a good strategy. The biggest of the events, the most well-known, was Shays' Rebellion here in Massachusetts. Governor James Bowdoin, that's him in the upper left there, he raised taxes and insisted on collecting gold and silver coins from farmers in the western part of the state. And starting in August 1786, 4,000 farmers with rifles gathered out there. And one of the places they met is that is Pelham Town Hall, which is still there if you go out to Pelham. One of the leaders was a fellow named Daniel Shays, who had been at the Battle of Lexington in Bunker Hill. That's a contemporary engraving, and that's him on the left, but I don't think his family would recognize him. It's not the most clear engraving. But in any event, for the next 6 months, armed farmers shut down the courts across the state. Great Barrington, Northampton, Worcester, Taunton, even Concord. Courts were shut down. The state was broke, so the state couldn't pay the militia to come out and defeat those farmers. So rich people in Boston contributed money for a private army, which they sent out into the western part of the state. And the big confrontation occurred when the Shays people tried to get the weapons from the Springfield Armory. The national government had an armory back then. They were driven away, and soon the movement disintegrated. But there was a new election in Massachusetts, and the people who voted for the high taxes were voted out, and the new people pardoned everybody. So, in a sense, the farmers won. Now, it is no exaggeration to say that Shays' rebellion terrified the political elite in this country. Here's George Washington. Good God! The rebels regard America's land as the common property of all. We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion. James Madison. The rebels want an abolition of debts, public and private, and a new division of property. Now, the bits about socialism weren't true, but it was not the last time that the people with wealth and power in America see a popular uprising that has legitimate basis and think it's about socialism or communism. You know, we know that is a paranoia that comes periodically in American history, and you might say it began here. The elite just didn't understand the tax situation that was facing the farmers in the western part of the states. Okay, by the mid-1780s, many Americans had decided that the Articles of Confederation were a failure. As I said, it couldn't collect taxes, it couldn't regulate trade and commerce, and as it became clear with Shays' Rebellion, it didn't have the resources to put down an insurrection in one of the states. Lots of people started wanting a stronger national government. I've listed them on that screen, and I must apologize. A lecture about the Constitution doesn't give itself to lots of fancy slides with interesting illustrations. So there's a bit more text today, and I do apologize. But as I've listed, you know, the people who are holding those government bonds thought a new national government was more likely to repay the loans. Merchants who were suffering from lack of trade thought that the national government could impose limits on imports and could prevent the states from taxing each other's trade. If you're making furniture and things like that in a city like Boston, you would like to have a tariff that prevents British furniture from coming off the boat and undercutting you. And if you're the elite in the country, you want to control the state governments that seem to be out of line, and you wanted to protect property rights. And in fact, Madison wrote that interference with the security of property rights by the state governments was the most important reason for calling the Constitutional Convention. There had been attempts to amend the Articles, but the amendments had to be accepted unanimously, and there was always at least one state that said no. The road to the Philadelphia Convention actually kind of starts in Annapolis. In 1786, delegates from 5 states met in Annapolis. That's the Annapolis State House, but they didn't actually meet there. They met in a tavern. And the tavern is what's in the lower right. It has survived to this day, apparently. So the folks wanted to talk about the burdens that were affecting trade among the states. But of course, they didn't have any power to agree to anything. But Madison and Hamilton, who were there, persuaded the folks at this Annapolis convention to recommend a bigger constitutional convention to take place the next year. And Congress agreed. In February 1787, Congress called for a convention, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Madison and his friends heading into that convention had something much different in mind than just revising the articles. So we're going to get into that. So here's where they met, Independence Hall in Philadelphia. There were 12 states represented. Rhode Island declined to send anybody. They didn't want to cooperate. The delegates voted to keep their deliberations secret. One reason was to encourage free debate, that they could say whatever they felt like and it wouldn't get out. And one reason was no doubt that they were, from the get-go, they were not talking about amending the articles. They were talking about replacing them with something new and different. They kept unlike that photo, they kept the windows closed, blinds drawn in the hottest summer Philadelphia had had in many years. And if if you've been to colonial reenactments, these people are not wearing light, comfy cotton clothing, right? They're wearing flannel in a room that doesn't have any air moving in it. And they didn't really have deodorant back then, so I can only imagine what it might have smelled like in that room. Maybe that explains why they got testy with each other at times. But this was a very different era. There was not a single leak to the press about what they were doing. Not a single one. Here's a famous painting of the convention done by a fella in 1940, and you can identify some of the famous people. You've got Washington standing up to the upper right. He was named as the president of the convention, so he sat up front and called on people. And you've got some interesting people in the center. The fellow with a profile whispering to Ben Franklin, that's Alexander Hamilton. And the small guy just to Franklin's right, he almost disappears in the picture, that's James Madison. He sat up front so that he could take notes on everything that was said. And his journal is the best source we have for what was actually said there. Now, there are three prominent Americans who weren't at the convention. John Adams was the American ambassador in London at the time. Thomas Jefferson was the American ambassador in Paris. And Patrick Henry said that he smelled a rat and stayed home in Virginia. He wasn't going to show up. There were 55 delegates. Their average age was 43. The oldest was Ben Franklin at 81. James Madison was only 36, and Alexander Hamilton was only 30, which, when I think about what I was accomplishing at age 30, nearly half of them went to college at a time when there were only 9 colleges in the colonies in the States, and going to college was extremely rare. More than half of them were trained as lawyers. That explains a lot. Most of them had made a lot of money or had married a lot of money. These were wealthy people. They had tons of political experience. You had 8 of them signed the Declaration of Independence. 3/4 of them had served in the Continental Congress. 21 fought in the Revolutionary War. 7 had been governors of their state. This is the cream of the crop of America's political leaders. And as one historian puts it, and I love this, this was a convention of the well-bred, the well-fed, the well-read, and the well-wed. So the delegates' mandate from the Confederation Congress was to draft amendments. These guys wanted something entirely different, and to the point that one of the best histories of this convention is called the Framers' Coup, because this turns out to be a political coup. Now, it took them weeks to determine the structure of Congress and see if we can understand why. The conflict is usually described as small states versus large states, disagreeing about what Congress should look like. It's not precisely true. It's really about population growth and whether you have room for more population within your state because if your population is growing, your political power is going to grow in Congress. Whatever Congress looks like, some of it's going to be apportioned by population. So you have the states like New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, or New Hampshire, they have no unsettled regions that can grow. Many of the other states did. The first proposal for Congress came from James Madison. That's actually what he might have looked like at around age 36. His plan was you have two houses of Congress, both of them, the seats are apportioned by population. Okay, so the big states rule in Madison's world. The counter from the small states was presented by William Patterson. He's in the middle. He was from New Jersey. And he wanted to keep Congress just the way it was. One house with each state having one vote. So the little ones are just as powerful as the big ones. And after weeks and weeks of wrangling, Roger Sherman, there down at the lower right, from the state of Connecticut, proposed a compromise, which is close to what we have today. House of Representatives, divided seats by population, 2 years term, and each state gets to decide who's eligible to vote. The Senate, each state gets 2, and the senators were going to be selected by the state legislatures. The delegates approved Sherman's wonderful compromise the very same day he recommended it. They were certainly sick of the fighting. So what could Congress do? The powers of Congress appear in Article 1, and it can raise money and spend money for the common defense and general welfare. And you can imagine the Supreme Court has spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that meant. What's the general welfare? But that's not today's problem. The Congress had the power to regulate foreign trade, putting in a tariff, and to regulate commerce among the states. It could borrow money, coin money, post offices, declare war, raise a military, and then at the end of the list of what Congress can do, there is something that says that Congress can pass all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So Congress can do anything else if it's necessary and proper. Again, the Supreme Court has had a lot of fun trying to figure out what counts as necessary and proper. Okay, the executive branch. They decided, there were talk about having a committee, but eventually they settled on having a single executive with a 4-year term. Madison came up with the design for the Electoral College. And in case you don't know, the way the votes are assigned in the Electoral College is a state gets the number of its seats in the House of Representatives plus 2 for its senators. So it's basically by population. If nobody gets a majority, then the election goes to the House of Representatives, where the states vote, each state has an equal vote, which has happened twice in our history. Their theory was, the person with the most votes gets to be president. The person who comes in second gets to be vice president. That seems natural. And they were all assuming that the guy who would get the most votes was George Washington. So they weren't too worried about what the president could do. I have listed some of the powers the president would have. They're quite broad. The president has the power to appoint officers, which I suddenly realized might suggest that he himself is not an officer. And for those of you who are still wondering about whether Trump can be on the ballot, that might be an argument against keeping him off. But again, I have no idea, luckily. And the president can veto legislation. The judicial branch shows up in Article 3. They didn't do much of it. They spent little time worrying about the courts. They mandated a Supreme Court, and then they had whatever other courts Congress feels like creating. Quite literally true. Congress has total control over the structure of the lower court system. So why do you need federal courts? And the main explanation was you want a court that is where the judge is likely to be neutral. If everything gets fought out in a state court, the judges in the state court are likely to favor the people from their state if there's a dispute with the government or with somebody from another state. So the idea was you need a neutral forum. So federal courts can decide cases arising to, interpreting the Constitution or federal law, cases if the U.S. is a party, and then controversies between either two states. If I want to sue Georgia, do I want to be in a Georgia state court or a federal court? Obviously, I want to be in a federal court down in Georgia. It improves my odds. And if I sue somebody from Arkansas, the federal court can handle the case, not a court in Arkansas, which has created an enormous problem of trying to figure out when the people in a lawsuit are from different states. Like, where does a corporation exist? That became a big legal headache. All right, so that's the kind of general structure of what the three branches can do. The delegates in Philadelphia they really had a big problem because they were truly conflicted, as we would say today. On one hand, they did want a stronger national government that could do the various things we've talked about, but they also really, really believed that power is dangerous. And having just escaped from Great Britain, with the king having all kinds of power and being able to do pretty much anything he wanted, they had some reason to be afraid of power. So they didn't want too much power in anybody's hands, any single person or any single group. And so they designed a system where power is divided among the branches, and each of them has some power to limit what the other ones are doing. Civics classes refer to this as the system of checks and balances. One commentator I saw recently blamed Madison for creating a recipe for gridlock, because on one level, they didn't really want the national government to do a whole lot, and they wanted to structure it in a way that would prevent it from doing a whole lot in some ways. But, okay, so how does that work? I found that lovely diagram on the internet. This is all stuff you're somewhat familiar with, I'm sure, but just for a recap. Congress passes a law when the House and the Senate vote by a majority. The president can veto it. Okay, he can step in and say no, but Congress can step back in and say, oh yes, if they override the veto. Takes a 2/3 vote. The president can negotiate treaties, but he can't put them into effect. The Senate has to approve them. The president, vice president, and judges can be removed for high crimes and misdemeanors, a phrase we've all become familiar with, dating back to the Clinton administration. The House decides whether somebody should be impeached. The Senate acts as the court. And to convict, you need a 2/3 vote. The president nominates judges, but the Senate can approve them by a majority vote. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, gets to say whether one of the other branches has done something unconstitutional, and there's nobody who can override the Supreme Court unless you pack the court with your supporters, and down the road you may succeed, as happened with Roe v. Wade. But generally, the Supreme Court truly is supreme in that sense. All right. Structure of the government. The real tragedy of the Constitution, on one level, is, of course, the protection for slavery. I found myself some engravings of a little bit of discipline out on the plantations. Slavery was based on violence, on the threat of violence, and in many cases on truly horrendous violence, in which even the whipping shown on those engravings is not as bad as it could get. They nailed people to trees by the ear. They cut off hands. It was truly It was truly a horrendous system. Now, in the North, there were still about 40,000 slaves, 6% of the population. Most of them were in New York and New Jersey, but there were still 4,000 slaves in New England in 1787. In the South, there were 650,000 slaves. That's 1/3 of the population. But in Virginia, it was the slaves were more than 40%. And down on the rice plantations in South Carolina, slaves were a majority of the population. There were some small signs of progress on slavery in the 1780s, and happily, Massachusetts led the way. There was a fellow named Cork Walker, and we do not have any illustrations of him, unfortunately, but Cork Walker was owned by James Caldwell, who lived in Worcester. They were from a very prominent family. Caldwell promised Walker he would free him when Walker turned 25. Unfortunately, Caldwell died when Walker was 10. His widow renewed the promise to free him when he was 25. She remarried, then she died, and her second husband had no intention of honoring the promise. Walker ran away. He ran away to that farmhouse right there in the photo, where he was sheltered by a sympathetic family. His owner, named Nathaniel Jennison, found him, beat him mercilessly, and then locked him up. Somehow, and I don't know the backstory for this, somehow Walker managed to file a lawsuit for false imprisonment and assault. And the fella on the right there, that's Chief Justice William Cushing of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And he gave a charge to the jury in this case in which he conceded that slavery had been common practice everywhere in the states, in the colonies. But he said, a different idea has taken place with the people of America, more favorable to the natural rights of mankind and to that natural, innate desire of liberty with which heaven, without regard to color, complexion, or shape of noses, has inspired all the human race. A jury concluded that the phrase, all men are born free and equal, which appeared in the Massachusetts state constitution, which was written by John Adams, that phrase applied to Walker, and he was a free man. The jury awarded him 50 pounds in damages against Jennison. He moved to the town of Barra, where he got married, raised a family, and Massachusetts was the first state to legally abolish slavery throughout the state. Now, that's all nice, but the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had a very different view of slavery. 25 of the 55 delegates owned slaves, which meant nearly everybody from the southern states and a small number of the northerners. I mean, even Ben Franklin, right, paragon of liberalism, he owned slaves until at least 1781, when I think the final one died off. He never freed his slaves, Ben Franklin, even though he wrote against slavery. Go figure. So now the southern states threatened to walk out of the convention unless there was protection for slavery written in to the Constitution. And the northern delegates all thought that it was better to keep the country together and keep the southern states there than to let the convention be torn open by slavery. So the southerners had 3 demands on slavery, and the northerners caved in on every single one. The first is, all right, you're going to count people. You're going to count a population for determining how many seats a state has in the House of Representatives. The Southerners said, we want to count our slaves. Northerners, many of the Northerners said, but you think your slaves are property, so why don't we count other property, like the property we have? That led to a standoff, and what Congress came up with the Constitution came up with is a compromise. You count the number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. Technically, the Constitution didn't establish slavery, but it rewarded the southern states for having it. And this is really important because in each election, the South is going to get a bigger share of Congress, and when you have a presidential election, the southern states are going to have more electoral votes than they would be entitled to. And the result of this is that the South dominated both the House and the presidency all the way until the Civil War. Now, the second issue that the southern states were concerned about involved fugitives. Slaves had an unfortunate habit of trying to run away whenever they could. And the local policing that was done in the South made it very hard to escape, but there were always slaves who tried, especially from places like Maryland or Virginia, which were close to the Pennsylvania border. So the southern states demanded a fugitive slave clause, and that's what I put it up there. Basically, if a slave escapes to another state, that state has to cooperate in finding the slave and returning the slave to his or her owner. Again, this didn't establish slavery, but it puts the power of the federal government behind the rights of slave owners. The third question, The third one concerned the slave trade. Ships were still arriving every year with thousands of slaves fresh from Africa. By this point in the 1780s, many people in the North had at least come around to the idea that the slave trade was immoral and should be stopped. And several northern states outlawed the slave trade in the 1780s. The southern states were afraid that in the new Congress, New England and the mid-Atlantic states would do the same thing and outlaw the slave trade. They worked out a compromise where Congress could not get rid of the slave trade for 20 years. Even slave states like Virginia and Maryland went along with it because by this point, their slaves are so healthy and produce so many children that in Virginia there are more slaves than they know what to do with. And they'll be perfectly happy to sell their excess surplus slaves down to Georgia or South Carolina. Now, the word slave does not appear in the Constitution. Euphemisms. 3/5 of all other persons. Persons held to service or labor in one state under its laws. This is for the importation one. Such persons as the states think proper to admit. Madison actually told the delegates it would be, direct quote, it would be wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in man. Now, can you spell hypocrisy? It's perfectly okay to own those people. You just don't put it into the Constitution and admit it out loud. John Dickinson from Delaware wrote in his diary, omitting the word will be regarded as an endeavor to conceal a principle of which we are ashamed. And he was right. As the convention wound down in September 1787, that fellow on the left, Gouverneur Morris, his first name is spelled like the French word for governor. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. In any event, he was from Pennsylvania, and he did the final drafting in what we see today. And he added on his own, he came up with a preamble, which is pretty stirring stuff. We, the people of the United States. Now, under what possible understanding of the phrase, we the people, could those rich white guys in Philadelphia qualify as we the people? They were speaking for themselves and doing what they wanted to accomplish. The delegates were tired by September, and they were ready to go home. And at the very last minute, somebody said, wait a minute, don't you think we should have a Bill of Rights? Every one of the new state constitutions had a Bill of Rights. The majority of delegates didn't think you needed one. But here's their, we're shaking our heads, but here's their theory. we've only given Congress specific powers that are written out. The Constitution doesn't say that Congress can restrict speech. It doesn't say Congress can establish a religion. So if Congress doesn't have the power to do those things, why do you need a Bill of Rights that makes it official? That kind of made sense to the people at the time, but it turned out to be a big mistake when it came to the ratification process, as we'll get to in a minute. So there are the signatures. By this point, there were only 42 of the delegates left in Philadelphia, and all but 3 of them signed it. And the Confederation Congress then sent the draft Constitution to the states for ratification. The delegates were clever. No unanimous amendments for them. Ratification would occur when 9 out of 13 states said yes. The theory was, this is not the state governments creating this new entity. This is the people of the United States. The people are sovereign under their political theory. And what that meant was, so who gets to ratify it in a state? Well, not the old state legislature. They don't represent we, the people. We need a special new constitutional convention in each state to talk about ratifying. And once again, Massachusetts was in the lead because when Massachusetts adopted a new constitution in 1780, it had a very special convention just for that purpose. And that seemed to be the way it was supposed to go. Now, the supporters of the new Constitution called themselves Federalists, which was a bit deceptive because in the lexicon of the day, federalism sort of suggested something more like the Articles of Confederation. The Federalists did a number of clever things to try to diffuse people's suspicion. And the Federalists had some big advantages. All the best-known public figures in the country were in favor of the new Constitution, most notably George Washington and Ben Franklin. Most newspapers in the country were in favor. The opposition got stuck with the less than stirring label of anti-federalists. What were they afraid of? They were afraid of some fairly basic things. They were afraid that the rich and powerful in this country would run the show in the new government. What an odd idea that was. They were afraid that the federal government would overwhelm the state governments. They were afraid the federal government would trample on individual liberties. They were afraid the presidency might turn into a hereditary office and eventually morph into a monarchy. They're afraid of power. They're afraid of this new government giving too much power to the people who already have a lot. The most famous defense of the Constitution is known as the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton knew that he had a tough road in the New York ratifying convention. There were a lot of people from upstate New York who were very skeptical. To help push the cause in New York, Hamilton recruited some friends to help him write essays defending the new Constitution. They were signed by Publius, a public-spirited pseudonym, and the good friends that he recruited were James Madison and John Jay. So there the portraits are. Madison on the left handled the theory of the Constitution. Hamilton in the center handled all the things that were wrong with the Articles. And Jay, who had been a diplomat, handled foreign affairs, what the new government's role in foreign affairs would be. So over the next several months, in the winter of 1787 to 88, 85 of these essays appeared in New York papers. They didn't reach a huge audience outside of New York, but they were circulated in other states, and they are the closest thing we have to a statement of what the framers' political theory was. And I'm going to cover one aspect of that because it's one of the most famous components. The top left there, that is Federalist number 10. And that is an essay that Madison wrote to try to, we'll take a step back. There were very few democratic governments in the world at this time. Most everybody was a monarchy. There were the cantons in Switzerland had popularly elected governments. The Netherlands had one, but those are little places. And the conventional theory was that in a big country like this, democracy could never work. People would get out of control, there'd be too many people arguing with each other, it would turn into anarchy. So Madison had to try to create this structure of government for such a big country. And he believed that there actually is something in his mind that is the public interest. There's something out there that is what is best for the country, and people with virtue, that's the word they liked to use back then, people with virtue like himself knew what that public interest was. But most people are unfortunately focused on their private interests, what's good for them, not what's good for the country. So the problem, as Madison teed it up, was how do you prevent the United States from being pulled apart by what he referred to, the term then was factions. All these, we would call them special interest groups, perhaps. How do you prevent the country from being pulled apart by all these selfish groups with their own idea of what they want for them, just for themselves? It wasn't just interest groups in the abstract. Madison was pretty specific about what might tear the country apart. The most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. People are divided into creditors and debtors. There are people who own land, people who have merchant businesses, people who just have a lot of money and investments. The country's divided into a lot of people based in large part on who has what property. And that might sound dangerous, but Madison's justification was that size matters. He argued that if you make the government bigger, as he put it, you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, and you make it less probable that any one group could get a majority and lead the country in the wrong direction. And more specifically, he said, a rage for paper money. Remember, Madison was a creditor and did not like paper money. A rage for the abolition of debts and for an equal division of property or any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In other words, it's more likely that someplace like Rhode Island could get carried away protecting debtors, but the nation as a whole, there will be too many groups competing with each other, and that kind of dominance won't happen. He kind of invented the interest group theory of democracy, that you just let all the interest groups fight it out, and whoever, in Congress and for the presidency, and somehow what's best for the country will emerge. That was his optimistic view. So each state had a convention. Delaware was the very first one. It was unanimous, and that's why they've been putting that on their license plates since the dawn of time. Several other small states ratified it pretty quickly. The first close call was in Massachusetts. The Boston area was in favor. The western part of the state, there were a lot of delegates at the convention who had been part of Shays's army out there. So to try to save the day, the Federalists at the Massachusetts Convention said, well, why don't you approve this as it is, but also identify some amendments you'd like to see? And that idea of approve it now, but propose amendments, that managed to work. And in several of the big states, that compromise prevailed. The Constitution became official when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it. By the summer of 1788, 11 states had ratified, so more than they needed, and people started making plans for an election in 1788 in the fall, which we'll talk about next time. The two states that were left out were North Carolina and Rhode Island. And they continued to debate the Constitution for several more years before they finally joined. Madison was elected to the House of Representatives from Virginia, and he deserves credit. He took it upon himself to get those amendments through. The states had come up with hundreds of proposed amendments. Madison piled them all up on his desk and tried to combine them, throw out some, save others. He reduced the proposed amendments to 12. And Congress approved those 12 amendments. The First Amendment was a small change in how you calculate the number of seats in the House of Representatives. The Second Amendment was a pretty good amendment that would have prohibited Congress from giving itself a raise. But somehow, the states never ratified the first two on the list. So what we have today is Amendments 3 through 12. Okay? It is a complete historical accident that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are in the First Amendment. They weren't when it went through Congress. It didn't get numbered that way because people thought it was the most important. It got numbered that way because it happened to be at the head of the line of the ones that passed. The amendments became effective on December 15th, 1791, which happened to be my birthday, I'm happy to say. And you know them, but I've listed, there's the first 5, some of the most basic ones. Nobody ever really thinks about the Third Amendment because the government hasn't been trying to make you put soldiers on your sofa. The British had done that, but that hasn't been an issue here. But all the others, most of them, particularly at the top of this second list here, 5th through 8th, involve criminal procedure. And these are all protections that in one way or another had been recognized in the British legal system. Then they threw in 2 catch-all amendments. If we didn't list it, the people still have it as a right. In other words, don't think that if we left something out, that doesn't mean the people don't have it. It just means it didn't get on the list. The courts have had a lot of time struggling with, well, what other rights might there be that didn't get listed? When people are asked, what's your favorite part of the Constitution? What are you most happy that it does? Most everybody picks one of these amendments, right? I mean, nobody's all that excited that Congress can regulate interstate commerce or levy a tariff. Those were the big ticket items for the convention, but it's these things. And so essentially, you have the anti-federalists to thank for the Bill of Rights because they insisted on that kind of protection, and the Federalists were forced to concede the idea of more amendments. Okay. What were the Founding Fathers thinking? There they are again, looking all stirring. You've probably already sensed this from the way I've been talking, but the Founding Fathers did not trust ordinary people like us. They believed that America should be governed by wealthy white men like themselves who had the wealth and the education to devote themselves to politics and to know what was in the public interest. They were very afraid that white men with not as much property, all those thousands and thousands of farmers and shopkeepers and artisans, might gain control of the political process and do selfish bad things like issuing paper money and letting debtors off the hook. The Founding Fathers had a word for these things that they were afraid of, and that word was democracy. In the lexicon of the day, democracy sort of implied mob rule, the people running amok. I'll go back there, wait a minute, stop that. I can't even see where I am. There. Yeah, all right. Now we'll come back here. Where did they go? There they are. So behind closed doors in Philadelphia, the Founding Fathers, as we like to refer to them, were extremely blunt about what they thought about ordinary people. Alexander Hamilton. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God, but that is not true. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine correctly. Roger Sherman from Connecticut. This is great. The people should have as little to do as possible with the government. They lack information and are constantly liable to be misled. George Washington, after learning about Shays' Rebellion, the rebellion was proof that mankind left to themselves are unfit for their own government. And my favorite goes to John Jay. Now, he wasn't at the convention. He was a wealthy lawyer in New York who becomes the first Chief Justice afterwards. And he put it very, very succinctly. Those who own the country ought to govern it. Okay? So, behind closed doors, the Founding Fathers tried to draft a constitution that would make it hard for the majority of people with not so much property to threaten the property of the people who had a lot. And they did it in a number of different ways. Each congressional district was going to have 30,000 people. That was a lot back then. As a percentage of population, that is 5 times larger than our districts today. Madison was very blunt about why you wanted large districts. They would promote the election of men with a probable attachment to the rights of property. The Founding Fathers all wanted to have a property requirement for voting, but they couldn't agree on a uniform one that would apply to everybody. So they ended up letting each state decide who could vote for the House of Representatives. And at that time, only one state, only Pennsylvania, did not have a property requirement for voting. Most of the other states didn't drop property requirements for white men until after 1800. And John Dickinson, and there's a college named for him, he's important, said that property requirements are a necessary defense against the dangerous influence of those multitudes without property and without principle. Now, the Senate's job is to keep the House of Representatives in line. Madison was specific. The Senate will protect the minority of the opulent, that means really rich, against the majority. To ensure that the right men sat in the Senate, people weren't going to elect the senators, the state legislatures were. That didn't change until the 17th Amendment in 1913. And also, to make sure that the Senate was a stabilizing force, the senators got 6-year terms, and only 1/3 of them are up for election at any particular year. The idea here is they don't want Congress suddenly swept up with some popular passion of the moment and carried away too far. And if you have a Senate where only 1/3 are up every year, and the others get to keep sitting there, the power of the status quo is enhanced. Now, naturally, should the people elect the president? Obviously not. Roger Sherman said, "The people at large will never be sufficiently informed to make a wise choice for president." George Mason, there's a college name for him down in Virginia, I think. "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a president to the people as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." Madison's alternative was the Electoral College, where the state governments send electors, and it's those state governments they pick, and the electors then choose the president. Most states didn't let white men vote for the electors until the 1820s. And they also, as I suggested, they wanted to make sure the states couldn't continue to do bad things. So they As Edmund Randolph, as the governor of Virginia, said, he blamed all the nation's problems on the turbulence and follies of democracy. None of the state constitutions have provided sufficient checks against the democracy, by which he meant ordinary people. So Article 1 lists a number of things that the states can't do. There were all the things on Madison's list of things, bad things that the states had been doing. They can't issue paper money. They can't impair the obligation of contracts, which basically means if you owe a lot of money now, the state isn't supposed to be able to pass a moratorium and give you like 2 more years to get the money to pay it off. That would be a law impairing contracts. And then there's the supremacy clause. Federal law, the Constitution, are the supreme law of the land, and every state judge has to honor them. Okay, so this is the bottom line, if I haven't beaten this horse to death by now. The Constitution was designed to protect the political power of the social and economic elite and to prevent the states from doing bad things, which is kind of like taking the people out of popular government. But that's what they wanted. And we're going to give the last word. Where is he? There he is. We're going to give the last word to John Quincy Adams. In 1788, John Quincy was a brilliant young fellow who had just graduated from Harvard. He could speak 5 or 6 languages. He became a diplomat at about the age of 22. He was quite a talented fellow. And he wrote in his diary, and I actually found the diary, the handwritten diary. The internet is amazing. And he wrote, "The Constitution was calculated to increase the influence, the power, and the wealth of those who have it already. Its ratification will be a great point gained in favor of the aristocratic party," such as the party his father belonged to. Okay, so on that dose of cold reality on the myths about the Founding Fathers, we're done for today. For reasons I cannot explain, we're not meeting next week. But starting on Wednesday, January 10th, we'll be back here at 2 o'clock. And finally, there will be some consistency. Starting on January 10th, will be every Wednesday at 2 until I run out of steam. Next week, now we have the Constitution in effect, ratified, and next week we'll start talking about, well, what happened when it got up and running? What did the new national government look like, and did it fulfill the goals of all the Madison and Hamilton and all those people at the convention? Did they get what they wanted? We'll have to talk about that a bit next week. So, thank you all. See you next year.